James didn't expect anything unusual that morning on Space Station Delta. He was checking his plants in the botany lab, recording their growth patterns under artificial gravity, when the station's intercom announced the arrival of the crystalline species delegation. The human scientist barely looked up from his work. Alien delegations weren't uncommon on the station. It was, after all, a hub for interspecies research. But when the lab doors slid open with a soft hiss, something made him turn around. She stood there, gleaming like polished quartz under the lab lights. Her body was vaguely humanoid but seemed to be made of translucent crystal layers that shifted and moved with liquid grace. Two large, faceted eyes studied him with obvious curiosity. "Oh, sorry," James said, straightening up. "I didn't realize the delegation would be touring the botany section." He tried to tidy up his messy workstation. The crystalline being moved closer, her structure catching the light in fascinating ways. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that the universal translator couldn't quite filter out, "I came here specifically. I'm Lyra, xenobiologist." James noticed she was holding some sort of scanning device. It hummed softly as she approached. "I'm James. What brings a xenobiologist to the plant lab?" "Not the plants," Lyra admitted, her crystalline form shifting in what he would later learn was their version of excitement. "You, humans. You're so different from any species I've studied." The scanner in her hand beeped, and her faceted eyes widened. "Fascinating. Your internal temperature, it's so high. And these constant rhythmic movements inside your body." James couldn't help but laugh. "That's just my heartbeat. Pretty standard equipment for humans." Lyra moved closer, seemingly forgetting all protocol. "You mean your circulatory pump maintains that rhythm constantly, even now? How inefficient, yet brilliant. And your skin, it's actively regulating temperature through microscopic liquid release." "You mean sweating?" "Yeah, though I try not to do that too much in professional settings," James joked, but Lyra was too absorbed in her readings to catch the humor. "Your species maintains mobility and function despite constant internal motion, liquid circulation, and chemical reactions that would destabilize most crystalline life forms," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "How do you not fall apart?" James scratched his head, feeling both amused and slightly self-conscious under her intense scientific scrutiny. "Well, we're pretty well put together, I guess, though I never thought about it that way." "Would you?" Lyra's form shifted in what seemed like hesitation. "Would you consider allowing me to conduct a more detailed study? For scientific purposes, of course. Human biology is severely underdocumented in our databases." There was something in the way she said it, eager yet trying to maintain professional distance, that made James smile. "Sure, why not? As long as it doesn't involve taking me apart to see how I work." Lyra's crystal structure brightened noticeably. "Wonderful, and no disassembly required, I assure you. Though the fact that you can make such jokes about your own structural integrity is also fascinating." As she began setting up her equipment, James had a feeling his routine days on Space Station Delta were about to become much more interesting. 3 days after their first meeting, Lyra presented her research proposal in James's lab. She had prepared a detailed holographic display showing basic human anatomy, which floated between them like a glowing blue ghost. "So," James said, looking at the rotating image of a human circulatory system, "what exactly do you want to study?" Lyra's crystalline form sparkled with enthusiasm. "Everything. But primarily, I want to understand how your species maintains such complex biological processes without breaking down. For example," she gestured, and the hologram zoomed in on a heart. "This pump of yours." "Heart," James corrected gently. "Yes, heart. It beats approximately 100,000 times per day. The mechanical stress alone should cause rapid deterioration, yet humans live for decades." Her faceted eyes gleamed with excitement. "Our species would shatter under such constant internal motion." James leaned back against his workbench. "What kind of tests are we talking about?" Lyra brought up another hologram, this one showing various medical devices, non-invasive scans, mostly, recording your vital signs during different activities, perhaps some endurance tests. She paused, her crystal structure shifting in what James now recognized as nervousness. And I'd like to observe you during your daily routine. You want to follow me around? James raised an eyebrow. For science. Lyra quickly added, your species performs so many interesting biological functions throughout the day. The way you process nutrients, regulate temperature, repair minor damage. James couldn't help but chuckle. You make eating lunch and healing paper cuts sound like superpowers. From my perspective, they are. Lyra moved closer, her crystal form catching the lab lights in rainbow patterns. Did you know that humans are one of the few species that can repair damaged tissue while remaining fully functional? Most species either replace damaged parts entirely or enter stasis for repairs. Really? James had never thought about it that way. Well, I suppose you can tag along. Just, maybe not in the shower. Lyra's form clouded slightly in confusion. Shower. Ah, your daily water-based cleaning ritual. Actually, that would be fascinating too. No, James said firmly, but with a smile. Of course, of course. Lyra quickly made notes on her datapad. We'll establish proper boundaries. Though the way your epidermis responds to water temperature variations is really quite remarkable. As she rambled on about skin cells and temperature regulation, James noticed something curious. Despite her scientific detachment, Lyra kept shifting closer to him, her crystal form giving off a soft, warm glow he hadn't seen before. When do we start? He asked, interrupting her detailed explanation of sweat glands. Now. Lyra's whole form brightened. Unless you're too busy with your plants. James looked at his workstation, where several specimens needed attention. But somehow, the idea of being a research subject for this enthusiastic alien scientist seemed more interesting than measuring leaf growth. The plants can wait, he said. Let's do some science. Lyra's happy glow lit up the whole lab, and James wondered if she realized that she was becoming just as fascinating a subject of study as he was to her. After 2 weeks of research sessions, James and Lyra found themselves spending their lunch break in the station's observation deck, watching the stars drift by through the massive window. So your species doesn't eat at all? James asked, taking a bite of his sandwich, while Lyra scanned his chewing motion with obvious fascination. We absorb energy directly through our crystalline matrix, she explained, her form shimmering as she demonstrated by turning slightly toward the starlight. Much more efficient than your mechanical breakdown process. James swallowed and grinned. Maybe, but you're missing out on bacon sandwiches. I'm more interested in how you process emotional responses, Lyra said, moving her scanning device closer. Your heart rate increases slightly when you talk about food you enjoy. And when you smile, fascinating, multiple muscle groups activate simultaneously. You don't smile in your culture. We change our luminescence to show emotion, Lyra demonstrated by glowing brighter. Like this for happiness, but physical movements like your facial expressions. She trailed off, studying his face intently. James felt his cheeks warm under her gaze. The scanner in Lyra's hand beeped rapidly. There, your surface blood vessels just dilated. Is that discomfort? Embarrassment? She leaned closer, her crystal form catching the starlight in mesmerizing patterns. A bit of both, James admitted with a laugh. Humans usually get self-conscious when someone studies them too closely. Self-conscious. Lyra repeated the word thoughtfully. Your awareness of self is remarkably acute. My species considers individual consciousness as just one facet of our collective structure. As she spoke, James noticed her own crystalline form had taken on a slight pink tinge. He wondered if she was aware of it. What about music? He asked, changing the subject. Do your people have it? Lyra's form brightened with interest. We have harmonic resonance patterns, yes. Would you like to hear? Before James could answer, she began to vibrate subtly, producing a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The delicate notes seemed to dance in the air between them. "That's beautiful," James said softly when she finished. His heart rate monitor beeped, making Lyra's eyes widen. "Your pulse pattern changed during the resonance," she noted excitedly. "Here, let me show you the data." "Not everything needs to be measured, Lyra," James said gently. "Sometimes it's nice to just experience things." Lyra's scanning device lowered slowly. "Experience without analysis. That seems—" She paused, searching for the word. "Inefficient," James suggested with a smile. "Yes." Her form brightened again, yet intriguing. "Like many things about humans." She hesitated, then added, "About you." The moment hung between them like suspended starlight. James felt his heart rate increasing again. And for once, Lyra didn't reach for her scanner to measure it. Instead, she simply sat with him in comfortable silence, their forms, one solid, one crystalline, reflecting the endless stars beyond the window. Sometimes, they both realized, the most important discoveries happened when you weren't trying to measure them at all. A month into their research, things began to change in subtle ways. Lyra found herself making excuses to visit the botany lab even when she had no data to collect. Her crystal form would automatically brighten whenever James entered a room, something she couldn't seem to control. Today, she was supposed to be monitoring his physical response to different environmental conditions. Instead, she kept getting distracted by the way his hands moved as he tended to his plants. "Your dexterity is remarkable," she said, trying to sound scientific. "The fine motor control required to handle such delicate specimens." "You're not even scanning anything," James pointed out with a knowing smile. Lyra's form flickered in embarrassment. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her scanner upside down. "I was making mental observations," she said quickly, her crystalline surface taking on that pink tinge that seemed to appear more and more frequently around him. James set down his plant mister. "You know, for someone studying human biology, you've been pretty quiet about your own species. How do crystalline beings handle personal relationships?" The question made Lyra's entire form pulse with unexpected warmth. "We align our structural frequencies with compatible individuals. It's a very logical process." She paused, then added softly, "Usually." "Usually." James stepped closer, and Lyra's sensors registered his elevated heart rate. She told herself it was purely scientific interest that made her record this detail. "Sometimes," she continued, her voice carrying an unusual resonance, "we encounter patterns that don't match our normal parameters, frequencies that shouldn't attract but do. It's inefficient." James smiled. "Life often is." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken observations. Lyra noticed she was unconsciously synchronizing her energy field to match his biorhythms, a deeply intimate gesture among her people. She quickly adjusted herself, hoping he hadn't noticed. But James was more observant than she'd given him credit for. "You're glowing differently," he said. "Sort of pulsing. Is that normal?" "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "A simple resonance fluctuation. Perhaps I should review today's data." She turned to leave, but James gently caught her arm. The touch sent a cascade of sparkles through her crystalline form. "Your surface temperature just spiked," he noted, mimicking her scientific tone with a grin. "Fascinating biological response. Perhaps we should document it." Lyra realized he was teasing her, using her own research terminology. Her form shimmered with mixed embarrassment and delight. "That would be—" She struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. "An inefficient use of research time." "Since when do you care about inefficiency?" James asked softly. "I thought that's what fascinated you about humans." Lyra's entire being seemed to sparkle. "There are many things that fascinate me about humans, about one human in particular." The moment her words registered, she quickly added, "From a purely scientific perspective." "Of course." "Of course," James agreed, but his smile suggested he didn't believe it any more than she did. As they stood there, both pretending to focus on research neither was actually doing anymore, Lyra wondered if there was any scientific way to measure the feeling growing in her crystal core. Somehow, she doubted even her most advanced scanners could quantify this. The emergency alarms on Space Station Delta blared without warning. A coolant leak in the station's primary reactor threatened to destabilize the entire power grid. All non-essential personnel evacuate to safe zones immediately, the station's AI announced. Engineering team to reactor level. James was halfway through explaining photosynthesis to Lyra when the alarm started. His expression changed instantly from relaxed to focused. "The reactor's in the section below us," he said, checking his datavat. "Most of the engineering team is on the other side of the station." Lyra's crystalline form flickered anxiously. "The radiation levels are rising. It's not safe for organic life forms." But James was already moving toward the emergency access panel. "Someone has to stabilize it until the engineers arrive. I've got basic reactor training." "No." Lyra's form pulsed with alarm. "Your biological structure can't withstand those radiation levels. My crystalline form would be much better suited." "Your people are sensitive to extreme temperature changes," James interrupted, pulling out an emergency radiation suit. "That coolant is cold enough to shatter you." Before Lyra could argue further, James was climbing down the access ladder. She followed, her sensors screaming warnings about the deteriorating conditions. In the reactor room, emergency lights cast everything in a red glow. James moved quickly to the control panel, his hands flying over the controls. Sweat beaded on his forehead inside the radiation suit as he worked. Lyra's scanners showed his vital signs spiking. Elevated heart rate, adrenaline surge, increased body temperature. Yet his hands remained steady, his movements precise. "The manual override isn't responding," he grunted, moving to the physical coolant valves. "Have to do it directly." "James, the radiation exposure," Lyra began. "I know," he said, straining against the stuck valve. "But if this reactor goes, everyone on this station dies." Lyra watched in amazement as his muscles tensed, veins standing out on his neck, as he put his entire body weight into turning the valve. Her scanners recorded everything. The tremendous physical effort, the stress on his skeletal structure, the way his body somehow kept functioning despite the harsh conditions. With a metallic screech, the valve finally turned. Coolant hissed through the pipes, and the warning lights began to fade. James slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. "See," he managed between breaths. "Humans aren't. Completely fragile." Lyra moved closer, her sensors confirming that radiation levels were dropping. "You risked severe cellular damage, potential organ failure, yet you didn't hesitate." James smiled weakly. "Sometimes you don't think about the risks. You just do what needs to be done." The engineering team arrived then, taking over the situation. As they helped James back to the medical bay, Lyra realized something had changed within her crystalline core. This wasn't just scientific fascination anymore. She had watched him willingly risk his life to save others, had seen the incredible combination of physical weakness and unshakable determination that made humans unique. The emotion crystallizing inside her had no scientific name, no measurable quantity. But as she watched the medical team check him over, she knew with absolute certainty that she was experiencing what humans called falling in love. "Your research has become inappropriately personal," researcher Lyra. Chief Researcher Nexus's crystalline form towered over Lyra in the station's conference room, their surface radiating disapproval in cold blue waves. "My observations of human resilience are purely scientific," Lyra responded, trying to keep her form from betraying her emotions with unwanted color shifts. "We've seen your scan logs. Your focus on this particular human specimen is excessive. And your own resonance patterns." Nexus paused meaningfully. "They show concerning irregularities." Meanwhile, in the station's medical bay, James was facing his own interrogation. "The board is concerned about your close contact with the crystalline researcher," Director Martin said, reviewing his tablet. "There are protocols about fraternization with alien species. We're conducting approved research," James replied, unconsciously touching the bandage where he'd received treatment for minor radiation exposure. "Research that had you rushing into a radioactive area." The director raised an eyebrow. "The engineering report suggests you acted with unusual urgency when you realized crystalline beings would be vulnerable to the coolant temperatures." Back in the conference room, Nexus was still lecturing. "Our species has spent millennia perfecting the purity of our resonance. Emotional entanglement with a biological entity is primitive, beneath us. Their form pulsed with authority. End this research project immediately." Lyra's surface rippled with defiance. "Humans aren't primitive. Their adaptability, their emotional capacity, these are strengths, not weaknesses." James proved that in the reactor incident. "You use his personal designation," Nexus noted coldly. Another concerning sign. In the medical bay, James stood up despite the doctor's protests. "With all due respect, Director, Lyra's research is valuable. She's documented human capabilities that other species never noticed." "Yes, she certainly notices a lot about you," the director said dryly. "The board suggests you transfer to another station. Put some distance between." "No," James's voice was firm. "I'm not leaving my work, or her." The director sighed. "Then you leave us no choice but to make it an order." At that same moment, Nexus was delivering a similar ultimatum to Lyra. "Either end this inappropriate association, or we will recall you to the Crystalline Collective for realignment." Lyra's form went completely still, a sign of deep distress in her species. The thought of never seeing James again made her core structure vibrate with an emotion she couldn't suppress. "I need time to consider," she managed to say. "You have one station cycle," Nexus declared. "Choose wisely." As both James and Lyra left their respective meetings, they unconsciously moved toward their usual meeting spot in the observation deck. When they saw each other, both started speaking at once. "They want me to transfer. They're threatening realignment." They stopped, sharing a moment of understanding. The space between them felt heavy with unspoken words and impossible choices. Finally, James spoke softly. "What do we do now?" Lyra's form shimmered with uncertainty. "I don't know. For the first time in my existence, I can't calculate the most logical course of action." They stood in silence, watching the stars, both knowing that tomorrow would force them to choose between duty and the inexplicable connection they'd found across the vast divide of their different species. The hydroponics garden was empty late in the station's night cycle. James sat among his plants, while Lyra's crystalline form cast gentle prismatic patterns on the leaves around them. "A crystalline being and a human," James said softly, breaking the long silence. "Has that ever happened before?" Lyra's form shifted thoughtfully. "There are no records of such a pairing. My people consider biological entities too unstable for lasting bonds." "Because we die?" James asked directly. "Because you change," Lyra responded, her voice carrying a musical note of sadness. "My species can exist for centuries, virtually unchanged. But humans, we grow old." James nodded. "Our cells break down. We're messy and complicated." "Yes." Lyra moved closer, her surface rippling with emotion. "Yet somehow, that very impermanence makes you more fascinating. You know your time is limited, but you love and build and dream anyway." James reached out, gently touching her crystalline surface. As always, the contact sent sparkles of light dancing through her form. "What happens when a crystalline being bonds with someone?" he asked. Lyra's form glowed softly. "We synchronize our core frequencies, share energy patterns. It's intimate, but I don't know if it would even work with human biorhythms." "We could find out," James suggested. The words hung between them like starlight. "It could be dangerous," Lyra warned. "My energy field might disrupt your neural patterns. Your organic systems might reject the resonance." James smiled. Sounds like we need to do some research. Lyra's form brightened despite her concerns. Always the scientist. Says the one who's been scanning me for months, he teased. They both laughed, the sound of his human chuckle mixing with her crystalline chimes in an unexpectedly harmonious way. There would be challenges, Lyra said seriously. Beyond just the biological differences, my people won't understand. Your people might fear it. People fear what they don't understand, James agreed. So we'll help them understand. Show them that different species can complement each other instead of just tolerating each other. Lyra moved even closer, her form beginning to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. You would face discrimination, criticism. Your career might suffer. Worth it, James said simply. And one day, Lyra's voice wavered. One day you will age, and I will not. James was quiet for a moment. Then we'll make the time we have matter. Quality over quantity, right? Isn't that proper scientific methodology? A bright pulse of affection swept through Lyra's form. Using my own scientific principles against me. Learning from you, he corrected with a smile. Lyra's surface shimmered as she made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she began to adjust her energy field, matching it to the unique rhythm of his human biology. This might feel strange, she warned. Everything about us is strange, James replied. That's what makes it beautiful. As their energies began to align, creating patterns neither species had ever seen before, both the human scientist and his crystalline companion realized they were charting entirely new territory, not just in xenobiology, but in the nature of love itself. The crystalline council chamber glittered with the combined light of dozens of crystalline beings. Lyra stood before them, her research data projected in shimmering holograms around her. Honored Council, she began, her form steady despite her nerves. My research on human biology has revealed unexpected discoveries. We are aware of your personal involvement with the subject. One council member pulsed disapprovingly. Yes, Lyra said firmly. And that involvement has led to the most important finding of all. The holograms shifted, showing complex energy patterns, her own crystalline frequencies intertwined with James's human biorhythms. Our species believed biological entities were too chaotic for true resonance, she continued. We were wrong. Humans don't just tolerate chaos. They thrive on it. They grow from it. And in doing so, they've developed patterns we never thought possible. She displayed recordings from the reactor incident. Their adaptability isn't weakness, it's strength. Their emotions don't make them unstable. They make them resilient. These are known facts. Another council member interrupted. Your point. Lyra's form brightened with determination. My point is this. James and I have achieved something unprecedented. A stable resonance between crystalline and organic life. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several council members flickered with disbelief. Impossible, one declared. Show us. Lyra activated her final hologram, a real-time display of her core frequency. As James entered the chamber, escorted by guards, the pattern visibly shifted, harmonizing with his presence. By all our scientific principles, this shouldn't work, Lyra acknowledged. But it does. Just as humans shouldn't be able to survive their chaotic biology, but they do. Just as they shouldn't be able to maintain consciousness through sleep cycles, but they do. She moved closer to James, their energies visibly synchronizing. We've spent centuries pursuing perfect order, thinking it was the only path to advancement. But look. The holographic displays showed their combined energy patterns creating entirely new frequencies. This isn't contamination of our purity, Lyra declared. It's evolution, growth, discovery. The council chamber filled with conflicting light patterns as the members debated silently among themselves. James stood quietly, but his presence radiated support. Finally, the head council member spoke. Your findings are compelling, but they challenge millennia of crystalline doctrine. What exactly are you asking of us? Lyra's form glowed with quiet confidence. I'm asking you to choose between clinging to old assumptions or embracing new possibilities, between isolation or connection, between fear or hope. She reached out, her crystalline fingers intertwining with James's human ones. Light danced between them. I've made my choice, she said simply. The council chamber erupted in a cascade of light patterns: shock, disapproval, curiosity, and something that might have been admiration. The head council member raised their form to full height. You understand the consequences, the responsibilities, the risks. Yes, Lyra answered, squeezing James's hand. And I choose them all. Their decision would reshape relations between their species forever. But in that moment, as crystalline light merged with human warmth, neither Lyra nor James was thinking about making history. They were too busy making their own future. 1 year after Lyra's presentation to the council, Space Station Delta had changed dramatically. The botany lab, once James's quiet workspace, had become the center for interspecies research. The energy synchronization is stable, a young crystalline researcher reported, scanning a human volunteer, just like in the original case study. James and Lyra watched from the observation deck above, their own energies humming in perfect harmony. Her crystalline form had developed subtle patterns that matched his heartbeat, while his vital signs had adjusted to resonate with her frequency. Remember when you first scanned me? James asked, smiling at the memory. You were so excited about my heartbeat. I still am, Lyra replied, her form shimmering with affection. Though now it's less about the scientific readings and more about this. She pulsed her energy field in sync with his heart. Below them, more pairs of humans and crystalline beings were learning to synchronize. Not all for romance, some for medical research, others for enhanced communication, and some simply out of curiosity. The Council's latest report shows a 200% increase in cross-species understanding, Lyra noted proudly, and 3 more crystalline human pairs have achieved stable resonance. Not bad for a primitive biological species, James teased. A group of medical researchers had gathered in one corner, where a crystalline healer was demonstrating how their energy fields could accelerate human tissue repair. In another area, human engineers worked with crystalline experts to develop new technologies that combined both species' strengths. Director Martin wants us to write a formal paper, James said, about our experience, for the Interstellar Scientific Journal. Lyra's form brightened. Should we include the part where you nearly got yourself irradiated to save the station? Only if we include how you defied your entire species' beliefs for love, he countered. Their playful banter was interrupted by an alert on James' datapad. Another ship was docking, this one carrying representatives from 5 different species, all interested in learning about the Crystalline Human Resonance Project. Ready to show them what's possible? James asked. Lyra's form pulsed with confidence. As long as you're with me. They made their way to the docking bay, passing more mixed pairs of researchers along the way. Each crystalline human duo was discovering new ways to combine their unique abilities, creating possibilities neither species had imagined before. As they waited for the new arrivals, James noticed Lyra's form had taken on that familiar pink tinge. Even after a year, some things hadn't changed. Your surface temperature is elevated, he said in his best imitation of her scientific tone. Fascinating biological response. Quiet, you, she chimed, but her form sparkled with laughter. The airlock cycled, and their visitors emerged. A diverse group of beings from across the galaxy, all drawn by the story of a human botanist and a crystalline researcher who had proven that love could bridge even the widest gaps between species. As they began their presentation, Lyra and James stood together, their combined energy patterns creating beautiful displays of light and life. They were more than just a case study now. They were proof that the universe's greatest discoveries often came not from careful calculation, but from having the courage to reach across the stars and connect with someone different. And that was just the beginning.